So I'm going to talk about two projects, one that came from my postdoc and one that came from my PhD. As I said, I just started as an assistant professor at NYU, so I'm going to speak only very briefly about how some of this past work connects to the projects that I'm starting now as I run my lab. But all of the work is about how we can use convolutional neural networks as a way to connect neural changes to performance changes that have been widely observed in the psychological literature. So the outline of the talk, first, I just want to introduce convolutional neural networks as a model of the visual system. They're well known in computer vision, but they also now have a lot of support as models of particularly the ventral visual stream. And then I will get into the first study on modeling the benefits of temporal processing and using recurrence in neural networks to do that, and then modeling the benefits of visual attention. And then at the end, I'll just kind of make some broad summary points about each of these projects. So convolutional neural networks, as I said, they're used very widely in computer vision to perform tasks in the real world, but they have a long history that kind of weaves between neuroscience and computer vision and engineering. So the basic kind of relationship between visual neuroscience and the functions of a convolutional neural network is what I'm showing here, which is that they were inspired by the finding from Hubel and Wiesel that simple and complex cells exist in primary visual cortex. They were studying cats. But so the simple cells, as Hubel and Wiesel defined them, they respond to very specific visual stimuli. Usually the stimulus has to be of a preferred orientation. And then they also have very specific spatial locations that they prefer. So you have to have a stimulus that has certain visual features and it exists in a certain visual space for a simple cell to respond to it. The complex cells also seem to have this feature selectivity of wanting a preferred visual feature, but they were a little more lenient in where that feature could be in space. So the way that Hubel and Wiesel posited that you get these kinds of complex cell responses from the simple cells is that a complex cell gets input from different simple cells that represent the same feature at different locations. And then you can get a complex cell that has a little bit more spatial invariance. In convolutional neural networks, the way these concepts are manifested is that you apply a convolution to an image. And so that's applying a filter of a set of weights to an image. And that can tell you where the feature that's represented by that filter, where that feature shows up in the image. And so you get responses that represent the existence of a feature at a specific location. And then you do that convolution over the whole image and you get responses for how present that feature is at every point in the image. And then pooling layers in convolutional neural networks get input from a small number of convolutional units that represent different spatial locations. So they end up with a bit of spatial invariance to that feature. And when you build these convolutional neural networks, you just repeat this convolution pooling. And so you go from something that's representing the basic features of primary visual cortex to something that can kind of represent the full computations of the ventral visual stream. So on the bottom here, I'm showing some of the basic properties of the ventral visual stream, which goes, from primary visual cortex V1 all the way up to IT. And when you go along that hierarchy, you get neurons that have receptive fields that increase in spatial size. And so you get that by having these pooling layers come one after another, where you're increasing the space, the space in terms of the image space that an individual neuron in the network responds to. And then also you get this complexity in terms of feature responsiveness. So you start with neurons that respond to very simple features, but then as you do this stacking of convolutions, you get something that's looking for patterns in an image, and then you get something that's looking for patterns in patterns of an image, and then eventually you can get quite complex feature responses. And if you train these neural networks as they normally are on an image and then give that a label that corresponds to what's in that image and do backpropagation to train these networks, you can get networks that can identify images in pretty complex, can identify objects in pretty complex images using these kind of basic features of increased feature complexity and spatial receptive fields. So when you have those trained models, those models that can perform visual tasks well, because they're trained to do so, what people started to see very quickly after these models became popular in computer vision is that you can use these models to predict neural activity pretty well as well. So this is kind of a setup here on the left of how these experiments normally go, which is that you show the same image to a trained convolutional neural network and to a human or animal, and you record neural activity from the human or animal subject, and then you can ask questions like, can I predict the response of a neuron to this image by using the activity of the artificial neural network in response to that same image? And when you compare the ability of these networks to predict neural activity to a bunch of previous models that were used in visual neuroscience, like the HMAX model, you see that these networks that are, the convolutional neural network is in red here, these networks outperform those previous models that neuroscientists have been using. And more importantly, you get a hierarchical correspondence between the models and the brain, which is to say, if you want to predict monkey V4, which is kind of an intermediate visual area, this says that you should use the second to last layer of these convolutional neural networks. If you want to predict IT, which comes after V4 in the brain, you should use the last layer of these networks. And so that shows that you can kind of relate the layers in the network to regions in the ventral visual strain. And so this was these results here are one of the earlier findings from this, but since then there's been a lot of literature exploring what kind of models can give you the best predictions, thinking about different ways to compare neural activity to the models, and so on. And so there's been a lot of work kind of showing the extent to which these models can capture neural data. So for my purposes, as I said, I am interested in making some connections between neural activity and behavior or performance on visual tasks. And these models are well suited for that because they can actually perform visual tasks, which isn't always true of computational models of the visual system. Sometimes they're designed just to mimic neural circuits and neural activity. These are ones that you can actually put in a real image that you can show to a subject as well, and you can get the network to perform a visual task. But at the same time, it's performing that task using neural populations that have some similarity to the populations of the brain. So for me, that's an exciting place to try to make this connection. And I want to focus on some areas where there are clear changes in visual task performance under different circumstances. So the first of those is with temporal processing. So there's a lot of work in the psychophysics literature that asks kind of how long do people need to see an image to be able to understand what's in it. And so this is a kind of a basic setup for these types of experiments where subjects fixate in the center of the screen. They're shown some target image, and then a variable amount of time later, a mask will come on. So the mask is this noisy, kind of snowy image. And in this study, it can come on anywhere between 25 and 150 milliseconds after the first image. So 25 milliseconds is a very short amount of time to have this target image on. The mask, it's been shown through a lot of work, is meant to interrupt the processing of what came before it. So it kind of activates the visual system in a way that kind of erases the information about the image that came before. And then after the mask, the subjects are asked about what was in this initial image that they saw. And there's a lot of kind of famous findings that show that when you present a full image, an image that's not degraded, it's perfectly visible, humans can actually classify that with very low presentation time. So you can see here that in red, with 25 milliseconds, people are already up to about 80% accuracy on this task, even with that very brief presentation before the mask. But if you start to degrade the image in some way, so here in this study, they put occlusions on the image to make it less and less visible, that amount of time is not enough. So in red, we're seeing the 25 milliseconds. You cannot get above chance performance really when the image has been substantially degraded. And so to recover performance, you need to give the subjects more time with the image. So as they get more and more time with the image in different colors here, they can start to have better and better performance, even when only 10% of the object of interest is visible. So these are kind of the three main features of this data that I want to build a model that can replicate. So the first is that if you see the full, clean, undegraded image, you don't need a lot of time with it. You can get to basically ceiling performance in kind of one quick feed-forward sweep of the visual system. If the image becomes substantially degraded, you should see a fall off in the ability of the network to classify it. But you should also be able to see that performance gets recovered if you allow more and more time. So if you want a specific level of performance, like 60% here, the more noisy and degraded the image is, the longer the amount of time you have to give the subject with it. But they can recover that performance if given more time. So those are the basic behavioral features of interest. And basically, people attribute the these behavioral findings that, the ability to classify an image changes with how much time you're allowed. They equate them with recurrence in the visual system. So having recurrent connections in the visual system allows for dynamics of neural activity, which allows for dynamics in behavior or visual task performance. And so the two main classes of recurrence that are thought of as relevant here, one is feedback recurrence. So that's when you have areas that are later in the visual system send connections back to earlier regions. So example from V4 back to V2 or V2 back to primary visual cortex. And then lateral connections refers to connections within a visual area. So connections within primary visual cortex, for example. And you can imagine that these different forms, the different anatomy of recurrence, you might think play different roles in visual processing. So feedback is taking information that's kind of more processed. It's taking information from areas that maybe have more object selectivity or have more connection to behavior and sending that back to earlier areas with the more fine-grained representation of the image. And then lateral recurrence is about kind of spreading information amongst neurons that represent things at the same level. So it has to do usually a lot with kind of spatial relationships between things and spreading that information out in a spatial way. So kind of the standard, neuroscience idea of structure is related to function. These two different types of recurrence have very different structure, and so therefore they might have very different functions in terms of how they help visual processing. So what I wanted to get at in using these networks is, can we look at how different forms of recurrence contribute to performance changes and try to kind of get a handle on what computations these different forms of recurrence are implementing that make them help the visual system in these cases of noisy image presentations. So to do that, I'm going to be working with this kind of small convolutional neural network. The ones that are trained on more realistic images are usually larger than this. They usually have more layers. But because my goal is to eventually try to understand how the neural network works after I build it, I wanted to make sure that it was something that could be, more easily studied in a way. So I'm using a network that has two convolutional and pooling layers, followed by a fully connected layer, so no convolutions there, and then a readout layer that indicates the class that the network believes that the image belongs to. And it's trained on the MNIST data set, which is just examples of handwritten digits. So there's 10 units in this readout layer, and the network is trained to classify these images of the 10 different handwritten digits. And so specifically what I'm doing here is I'm training the feed-forward network on these clean MNIST images. So no noise, no degradation, just exactly as you see here, pretty visible image. And then I'm going to train this feed-forward network. So I'm going to get all of the feed-forward weights in the network set based on getting the network to perform this task. And then I'm going to hold those feed-forward networks constant and add recurrent connections. And the reason to do this, there's a few different reasons. The first is that if I train the feed-forward network to classify these clean images, I know that I'm going to be able to replicate that first behavioral finding, which is that humans don't need a lot of time with clean images. So the way people interpret that is basically like one feed-forward pass of the visual system is enough to classify clean images because people can do it so quickly, there isn't really time for recurrence to be having such an impact. And so to replicate that in the model, I'm just going to train the model to classify clean images using its feed-forward connections. The second reason is that by doing it this way, it allows for more direct comparisons of how different forms of recurrence work, because I'm holding the feed-forward weights constant. All of the different forms of recurrence are going to be added to the same network. So if the different forms of recurrence seem to be doing different things, it can't be because they're working with a different feed-forward system. They're all working with the exact same feed-forward system, and they have to learn to modulate that feed-forward system in a way that is beneficial. And then finally, there's actually some experimental evidence from the developmental literature that suggests that the feed-forward connections of the visual system mature before the recurrent ones, especially before the feedback ones. So there is some sense that in animals, you are getting an effect where the feed-forward part of the visual system becomes steady, and then recurrent connections work within that. So that's how I'm doing it. And then I want to look into these two different broad anatomical classes of recurrence. So I'm going to add either lateral recurrence within the first layer of the network. So this is kind of like within primary visual cortex, or I'm going to add feedback connections that go from the second convolutional layer back to the first. So this would be like V2 back to V1. And as I said, the role of recurrence seems to be in helping process degraded images. So I'm going to build these networks so that they can classify these images that have different types of noise added to them. So some of the images have pixel noise, some have blur, some have low contrast, and others have occlusion. So I want the network to be able to use its recurrent connections to make the network good at classifying these degraded images, just as the behavioral data suggests the recurrence is doing in the brain. Okay, so I talked about the two anatomical forms or ways of adding recurrence, but then just having the connections there, obviously we need to set the specific weights that those connections have. And for that, there's two broad categories of options as well. The kind of default machine learning way of adding these recurrent connections is that you just train them on the task the same way that I train the feed forward connection. So I could just put these connections in, and then I can use back propagation to allow those weights to change in a way that will make the network better at classifying these noisy images that I put in. And so that's what I'm doing in the supervised or task train side of this, these four quadrants, is that I just add either feedback or lateral recurrence, and I allow those connections to change in response to these noisy images so that the network will be better at classifying the noisy images. So they're just directly trained on the task. The other way is to take more inspiration from biology, because using back propagation to train these networks is not biologically realistic, and it doesn't reflect kind of theories that we have about the role of what these connections are doing. So for the unsupervised or more biologically inspired side of things, I'm using two different approaches. For the feedback connections, I'm using an approach that's inspired by predictive coding. It's a little bit different than the standard predictive coding scheme, but basically what this way of adding connections does says that you want to take the neural network's response at the second layer and try to reconstruct the first layer's response from the second layer's response. And then you add that reconstruction back into the first layer. So you can see, and so this is trained only in response to clean images. So you can understand that basically what this is learning to do is kind of reconstruct the representation of a clean digit and put it back into the first layer of the network. And that could be beneficial in terms of kind of creating a process that could denoise that image. For the more bio-inspired lateral connectivity, I'm just putting in filters that implement surround suppression. So neurons that are near each other in the spatial dimension have a slight facilitatory effect on each other. They excite each other. Neurons that are farther away have a suppressive effect. And this is associated with things like sharpening of images. So these are the bio-inspired ways of adding these connections, and they come from previous work that has shown that these schemes can be beneficial. So that's the bio-inspired way, and then the other way is to simply let the network train on the noisy images. Okay, so putting these different forms of recurrence into the model and then looking at the behavior, we can see that all of these different forms of recurrence actually do replicate the broad behavioral trends that I talked about. So here I'm kind of plotting this just as the experimental data was plotted. So zero here, zero noise level, is a perfectly clean image, and then you have increasing levels of degradation of the image, and they're shown examples here on the left. And then the different colors represent different time steps in the network. So this is kind of equivalent to the time that the subjects had with the image. So 0 means just a feed forward pass, and then 1 round of recurrent influence or 2 rounds of recurrent influence is what I give the models here. And then you're just looking at the accuracy on their ability to classify these noisy images. And so you can see that so you can probably not see the tiny dots that represent the performance when there's no noise in the image, because they kind of all fall on top of each other, all the different time steps, because we're replicating that behavioral effect that with a clean image, you get to ceiling performance basically immediately, and you don't need the influence of recurrence. So that's showing up there. But then you also see with the degradation of performance that comes as you get noisy and noisier with the input images. So it's replicating that effect. But then as you look across the time steps, you see that if you want to recover performance, you simply allow the model to have more recurrent processing steps to recover that performance. And the task-trained networks show this effect more strongly than the bio-inspired ones, which is not surprising because they were allowed to train directly on the noisy images, whereas these were not, they did not see the noisy images at all, but they are still able to get increased performance on those noisy images. So behaviorally found networks that can match the broad behavioral patterns. But now the question is, are all these networks kind of implementing the same algorithms to get that behavioral output? Or can we say different things about what the different networks are doing? Maybe something that speaks to the relationship between the structure and function of the recurrence, or just in general, what kind of algorithms are these connections implementing that help the network? And to look at that, I'm focusing on neural activity at the first layer of the network, because this is the layer that is the target of recurrence, both for feedback and lateral recurrence. And so I want to look at how this activity changes over time as a result of the recurrent influence, and try to use that to understand what the network is doing, or how the recurrence works. So the specific metric that I'm looking at here is what I'm calling like a denoising metric. So the idea is if you look at the response of the first layer of the neural network in response to a clean version of a digit image, you can then ask how similar is the response of the network when a noisy version of that same image is shown before recurrence has effect, and then also after the recurrence has effect. So what this metric is asking is basically, does the recurrence make the response to the noisy image look more like the response to the clean image? So it's looking at how the correlation of the response to the different images changes over time as a function of recurrence. And you could imagine if you can get a network where the recurrence basically does this denoising, where it makes the response to the clean image look more, or sorry, the response to the noisy image look more like the response to the clean image, well, then you just push that representation through the rest of the network, and we know the network can classify clean images. So it's a very straightforward way of solving this problem. Just at the first layer, try to remove the noise, make it look like the network is seeing a clean image, and then go on with your classification. So I'm showing first here the results for the network that has the predictive feedback. So this is the bio-inspired feedback recurrence. And you can see here that this network does do this kind of denoising. The correlation of the response to the noisy image with the response to the clean image is stronger after recurrence. So it's making the response to the noisy image look more like the response to the clean image, which can then go on to help classification later. Another metric that I looked at here is the dimensionality of the activity in response to different images before and after recurrence. And what you can see is that the dimensionality decreases as a result of this predictive feedback recurrence. And that's consistent with this notion of denoising, because you can imagine you have kind of the feed-forward network that's trained on clean images. So it has some activity space that it's used to that represents the clean images. You give it these noisy images that have features that it's not used to, and it kind of causes responses to go off in all different directions. But then you get the recurrence that pushes everything back into the space that the network is used to dealing with. And so that's kind of the interpretation of the dimensionality result here. And you can see this effect is stronger, specifically if we look at images where the recurrence really helped, where the network initially incorrectly classified it, and after the recurrence was able to correctly classify it, you really get a stronger decrease in dimensionality. But looking at the task-trained network, so the same anatomy here, feedback connections, but task-trained instead of predictive coding feedback, these connections do not denoise the image. In fact, they do the opposite. You can see the correlation with the response to the noisy image and the response to the clean image goes down as a result of the recurrence. So these are not implementing the same strategy as the predictive feedback connections. They're doing something else. And this is further verified by the fact that the dimensionality goes up. So you're not getting this denoising, you're not getting a decrease in dimensionality that's kind of pushing everything back to the space the network expects. The task train feedback is using a different strategy. And in fact, the task train feedback and the task train lateral connections are almost identical in this pattern. So this is just a summary of this denoising broken down by each of the noise types. But you can see you start with this negative denoising value in the first layer of the task train networks, which is what I just showed you. But by the last layer, they're denoising. They have very strong denoising. So this explains why they're good at doing the task, because by the time you get to the last layer that's doing the classification, they look like they've denoised the image there, but they're not doing it by denoising it at a low level. In fact, they're doing the opposite. Whereas the bio-inspired ones tend to have more positive positive denoising values throughout. So the predictive feedback in particular denoises at the first level, and that just carries through to the end. And for the most part, surround suppression is doing that as well. So this is strange, I think, because you would expect that this kind of anti-denoising at the first layer would be a problem for the network. And yet it just goes on to be very beneficial for the network. And this is a way in which I think these networks can be helpful in a kind of meta level for understanding the brain, because I think if you were given this data about the ventral visual stream, where you saw that the impact of recurrence in area IT was very, very beneficial, and it looked like it was doing denoising, and you saw that in V1 it looked like it was doing some weird non-denoising thing, you would probably conclude that maybe there's some recurrence in IT itself that's responsible for those benefits. Whereas we know in this network that that's not the case. All of the benefits are coming from the first layer. All of the impacts of recurrence that lead the network to have better performance over time are coming from these changes in the first layer that look like they're actually doing the opposite. So to just have in our heads the fact that these systems can be this counterintuitive when you're trying to understand neural data, I think that can be helpful to think about. But actually looking at neural data, I used some data from this previous fMRI study where subjects were shown images with varying levels of blur, so that made it very comparable to what I'm doing in my network, and this especially for this denoising analysis. And I don't want to overstate these findings because they're very variable across subjects, and it's fMRI data, so it's noisy and the temporal resolution isn't great. But I'm showing kind of the best performing subject here. You can see that these denoising values that I showed with the network in this subject, they're all positive across all areas in the visual system, and also this dimensionality metric, you see a decrease across all areas. So that's consistent with the predictive feedback model more so than with the task train ones. So in this case, it seems like maybe biologically, the more kind of understandable solution is what's being done. Okay, so I just want to summarize this part of the talk. If you want more details, there's a bioRxiv preprint. But first, I just showed that recurrent neural networks can replicate human performance trends on noisy images. But somewhat surprisingly, the style of training seems to matter more than the actual anatomy of the recurrence, because the task train networks behave very differently than their anatomy matched counterparts. And then we can analyze these networks, which was my original goal, is to kind of analyze these networks to reverse engineer the algorithms they're implementing and use those as hypotheses for understanding real neural data. Okay, so now I want to talk about a different trend in the behavioral performance data that we can also tackle with these networks and make connections between the neurons and the behavior. And so that finding has to do with attention and what happens when you cue people to attend to certain things when they need to do a challenging visual task. And so in this example, subjects are fixating, they hear a sound that is supposed to cue them for what they should attend to in an upcoming visual stimulus. And that sound can either be a valid cue, meaning that they will be asked about the thing that they are told here. It can be a neutral cue, meaning it doesn't have any information, so it's just a white noise sound, or it can be an invalid cue, meaning it's not aligned with what they will be asked about. And so in this example trial, if the person heard the word pumpkin and then they were shown the stimulus, which is actually a drawing of a pumpkin with distractors on it, then on that trial, that was a valid cue and they would be asked if they saw a pumpkin or not. Or they could hear the word kangaroo, see this image, and be asked if they saw a pumpkin. And in that case, they didn't have the opportunity to attend to the thing that they would be asked about. And so these types of experiments are used to show that when you are allowed to attend to a thing because you're given a valid cue for it, your performance in terms of detection can be increased. So here the hit rate goes up if you're given a valid cue versus no cue or an invalid cue, and so does detection sensitivity. So there's this behavioral benefit of valid cueing. When you're able to direct your visual attention to something, you get a behavioral benefit. And so similar studies that are conducted, usually in non-human primates that are engaging in a similar task, from those kinds of studies, you can get information about what's happening neurally during this kind of cueing and deployment of attention. And so a lot of these findings are kind of understood in the framework of what's called the feature similarity gain model. So to understand that, first you have to think about a neuron's tuning curve. So just in black here, I'm representing the tuning curve of a neuron without any attention being deployed to anything. And so this neuron has a preferred stimulus direction. And then when the animal is asked to attend to a stimulus that aligns with the neuron's preferred stimulus direction, the response of that neuron gets scaled up multiplicatively. So you can see here, when attention is deployed to the neuron's preferred stimulus in this red curve, you just get a general increase in the neural response. If attention is deployed to a stimulus that's not preferred by this neuron, the tuning curve of this neuron gets scaled down in response to all different images. So this is showing how top-down attention, this kind of cued attention, scales neural activity up and down as a function of what the neuron normally responds to. And then also, if you look across, so this is kind of an example you'd find in a single neuron. If you look across neurons, across visual areas, you see the general trend is that these effects are stronger at later visual areas. So it's a little bit harder to find these things in V1. They're a little weaker. They show up a little later in the neural response. V4 is a very robust place to study these findings because they're much stronger there. So how can we use this knowledge of how neural activity is modulated by attention and put it into a model of convolutional neural networks to try to make this connection between the neural activity modulation and the performance changes? So for this study, I used a much larger convolutional neural network that was trained on the ImageNet test. So it is able to perform object recognition in response to more complex real-world images. And this is the architecture of it here. And so to add attention to this kind of network, as I just showed, the theory from neuroscience says that the way that attention modulates neural activity depends on that neuron's tuning. It depends on its normal response to visual objects. And so the first thing you have to do to add attention to these networks is to get their tuning curves, basically. So to get the responses of different artificial neurons to different object categories. So in this study, I was just using 20 randomly selected object categories. And so you can see that there are some object categories that this artificial neuron responds strongly to. There's some that it responds much less to. And so from that, we have a sense of what this neuron is doing and what it's tuned to. So therefore, when it's time to deploy attention in this network, when I want to cue the network to attend to something, let's say I want it to attend to this category number 11, and we can say that this is pumpkins. So let's say this is a trial where the person is attending to pumpkins. We want the model to be able to attend to pumpkins. Well, I know that this particular set of artificial neurons I'm recording from here responds strongly to pumpkins. So when I attend to pumpkins, I'm going to scale the activity of that unit up. And you can do that just by changing the slope of the rectified linear unit that is the normal activation function in these networks. So you scale the activity of that neuron up when attention is being deployed to pumpkins. On another trial, attention might be deployed to clocks. And on that trial, this neuron doesn't respond well to clocks. So its activity gets scaled down when attention is being deployed to that. And so you can just do that across all of the neurons at a given layer in the network. You just scale activity of those different neurons up or down depending on their tuning curves. And through that, you're just replicating the neural findings of how attention changes neural activity. Okay, so in addition to the neural side of it, I also need to give the network a task that's analogous to the behavioral studies that are used to study attention. And so this network, as I said, it was trained on ImageNet, so it's pretty good at just doing regular object classification. So if I just showed it a normal image, it has pretty high performance. When you study attention, you need to give the subject a challenging image, because that's when you really see the benefits of attention. People don't need attention when they're doing something easy. So we need to give the network a challenging task as well to be able to study the benefits of attention. So for that, I just took two ImageNet images and transparently overlaid them. So now the image is more complicated. And then I put at the end of the network a binary classifier for different object categories. So now in analogy to the behavioral study I talked about, where people, hear the word pumpkin, they're asked if they see a pumpkin. Now the network will attend to the concept of clocks, and then the binary classifier will be asking the network, is there a clock in this image? And in this case, the answer should be yes. So this is giving the network a more challenging image, and it's giving it kind of a setup that's analogous to the way that these things are studied behaviorally. Okay, so we have the network, we have the more challenging tasks that we're giving it, and we have all these different layers in the network that, as I said, kind of correspond to different regions in the visual system. And so now I can see what happens if I do these attentional modulations at each of the different layers in the network. Can we change neural activity in a way that will enhance classification performance on these tasks? And so the answer is yes, and you get this curve that corresponds to where the attention is deployed at the network at each of these layers. And when you deploy attention early in the network, the first layer of the network, you can get a slight increase in the binary classification performance of the network on these challenging images, but you get a much stronger increase if you do this later in the network. And so this kind of has some analogies to the fact that attentional modulations are actually stronger later in the visual system. This is showing that doing those attentional modulations later in the visual system is actually better for performance as well. Looking in a more fine-grained way about how these behavioral changes work, there's kind of an overall variable that you can play with for this, which is just the general strength of attention. So the tuning curve tells you kind of how much and in which direction activity should scale, but then you can just globally kind of make those changes bigger or smaller. And as I do that in the network, I'm tracing out this curve here in the false positive and true positive rate space. And so you can see that as you turn attention up and up and up, you get this performance benefit because the true positive rate is going up, but at the same time, the false positive rate is going up as well, meaning the network is kind of hallucinating. It's saying that an object that it's attending to is there even when it isn't. But the true positive rate increases faster than the false positive rate, so you get this net benefit of attention. And so this is the way that the network's doing it, but you could ask, are humans also having this increase in false positive rate when they attend to things? Or do they have a smarter attentional system that both increases true positives and decreases false positives? And so I looked at some of the behavioral data here, and in general, humans also show an increase in false positive rates as they deploy attention, and versus conditions where they're not attending. So you do get this same effect in humans, that attention gives you a performance benefit by making you able to detect things that you couldn't ordinarily detect, but it also makes you hallucinate a little bit. So this was, my initial question was, can you take the neural changes that are observed experimentally and use them to explain how performance changes happen? And this, the network is able to make that connection. We can say that those neural activity changes can lead to these performance changes. But another benefit of these networks as models is that you can ask questions you can't ask experimentally, which is, how should attention change neural activity? Is there a better way for attention to work in these systems? And so the tuning values tell you the neuron's response to an image. So it's this kind of bottom-up way of understanding function, where we assume that if a specific neuron is responding very strongly to a certain object category, then it must be responsible for classifying that object category. That's kind of a base assumption in neuroscience, that tuning tells you something about function. But in these networks, we can actually go the other direction and explicitly calculate, if I want to do better at classifying this object, how should a neuron's activity change? And so we can back propagate and calculate how a neuron's activity should change, so such that change makes the network better at classifying a certain image. And so these two different metrics, which both kind of claim to get at the function of a neuron, come from very different directions. And so this is an example of one of the artificial neurons. In green is the tuning curve, and in purple is this kind of optimal activity change, saying for each object category, how should that neuron's activity change to make the network better at classifying that category? So as you can see, there's a lot of misalignment here. There are times where the tuning, the neuron doesn't respond very strongly to a given object category, but these backpropagated values suggest that it should increase its activity a lot in order to make the network good at classifying that object category. So there's a misalignment here, and that kind of holds generally. So you can see here the correlation between these two different sets of values for each of the artificial neurons in blue here, and especially earlier in the network, they're pretty uncorrelated. And by the end, they get more correlated, but still not in absolute terms very high. So this is saying that how the attention should change is different than how the tuning curves would tell you the attention should change neural activity. And if we apply attention according to these optimal values instead of the tuning values, you actually do get a behavioral benefit at the middle layers of the network. So if the brain were using these kinds of values to target neurons for attentional modulation instead of tuning, it would actually get better performance. That's what this is suggesting. And so I said, the neuroscience literature tells us that that the brain is kind of the way that neural activity is modulated by attention relates to tuning. But those results are based on pretty sparse data. There's a lot of interpolation happening there. Usually in the experiments, animals will only really see two stimuli, and then there's kind of for the preferred, it is more strongly modulated than the non-preferred, and there's kind of a lot of interpolation happening. And so I don't think that at present we actually have enough data to be certain that attention modulates neural activity based on the tuning of the neuron. And so it could be that attention is modulating activity in a way that isn't perfectly aligned with tuning and actually is more understandable in terms of these kind of backpropagated values that I was just talking about that actually relate to what the neuron, the role the neuron plays in the network. And so there's a kind of a simple conceptual experiment that could be done to differentiate between those two effects. So the idea would be that in a lot of this work and what I talked about, people are studying detection tasks. So you can ask, is a 30-degree stimulus present in this image? And the subject will answer yes or no. And the idea is that if they're told in advance that that's what they're going to be asked, then they start to attend to 30-degree orientation, and you get a good performance when they're able to attend to that, meaning that they'll be able to detect it if it's there. Another type of task that you can ask subjects to do is more of a readout task. So what is the color of the 30-degree stimulus? It's not a detection task, but at the same time, it would benefit from people knowing in advance that they need to attend to the 30-degree stimulus. And so these are two different tasks that involve attention to the same feature, the feature of orientation at 30 degrees. And in the network, if you calculate how activity should change to make the network better at detecting a 30-degree stimulus versus making the network better at reading out the color of a 30-degree stimulus, the correlation between those two changes is very low. That's what's in orange here. This is saying that if you want to make the network better at each of these tasks, you don't modulate neurons the same way. They should modulate very differently. Whereas if you're just thinking in terms of tuning, in both cases, you would just say, well, find the neurons that respond strongly to 30 degrees and scale up their activity. The tuning, the notion of how attention modulates neural activity in both of these cases, if you're thinking about tuning, is the same. So this would just be a simple way, if you have this setup where technically attention is being deployed to the same visual feature, the same visual stimulus, but the goal of how you use that visual information is different, that would be a way to disambiguate if attention is modulating based on something like tuning versus based on something like the actual function that the neurons play in the task at hand. Okay, so that's the summary of this attention work. This is published in eLife with my PhD advisor, Ken Miller. So I just showed that the neural activity changes that have been found for attention in physiological experiments can capture or be responsible for the behavioral changes that are found as well. But also, if we think about kind of how attention would work in an optimal way, we might want to rethink the standard model of how attention modulates neural activity. And then what I didn't talk about, but what is currently the focus of some work in my lab, is how we can connect attention and perceptual learning, because there's a lot of literature showing that attention is helpful or necessary even to get subjects to be able to have benefits of perceptual learning. And again, these models offer a great place to play around with those ideas because you can study neural changes, you can study weight connection changes, and you can study performance changes, which is what's necessary for understanding perceptual learning. Okay, so and then my just kind of general points on this approach is that I showed that convolutional neural networks have these basic architectural features in common with the ventral visual stream. They can predict neural activity and they can perform visual tasks. And so this is just a great place to study the relationship between how populations of neurons represent activity and how that leads to performance changes. And I'm particularly interested in areas where there's a long history of literature in psychophysics and psychology, where we have clear settings where we know visual performance changes under different circumstances and replicating those in the model. So I just want to thank my collaborators. The attention work was done at Columbia with Ken Miller. The recurrent work was done at University College with Manish, Tom, and Sonia. And these are various funding sources that have supported me over the years. Thank you.